BIENALSUR es algo que ha nacido para quedarse.
Es horizontal, trabaja en red.
Ella
totalmente innovadora.
Que es capaz de unir
Múltiples sentidos, nuevas lecturas.
Unity to the world.
stereotypes de la violencia de género,
El arte tiene que
contaminación, interaction with the public,
incluye una geografía.
Un lenguaje de la frontera.
La magia llega.
El mayor evento cultural creado en Argentina para el mundo. Viví BIENALSUR.
I want to create a community of photographers here that will give into the children the various vision of the photography.
Lo bonito del proceso es ver cómo cada artista va generando sus ideas.
La idea de instalar un seguidor que señala a todos desde arriba es esta idea de quién fue.
Siempre utilicé mi experiencia cotidiana más que la historia del arte para construir mi trabajo.
D'avoir peur de disparaître, c'est le début de la vie en même temps. Parce que disparaître, c'est aussi naître.
Como artista, estamos voltados de reflectir problemas.
La construction misma del tiempo es una ficción.
Je cherche à installer de grandes trompettes qui, quand il y a du vent, représentent un peu le cri de la baleine.
それを受け入れる人の関係性ができた時にアートっていうのは成り立つのかなとは思うので。
La magia no aparece en cualquier momento. La magia llega si la sabes esperar. Y yo espero, como un cazador, a que eso suceda.
Art is part of the life.
Buenos días a todas.
Good morning to you all. On a timely basis, we are beginning this meeting, BIENALSUR, to discuss about the future possibilities, the possible future. I'd like to thank those who are joining me on the screen. Eduardo Basualdo, we all know him, a remarkable artist from Argentina. Manolo Borja, the director of the Reina Sofía Museum in Spain, a friend from Latin America. He's a former Minister of Culture and director of El Barro Museum from Paraguay. Those who I named so far have been customary guests in different BIENALSUR events. Volus Bajarpa, a dear friend, a Chilean artist, a very frequent participant of BIENALSUR, Betsabe Romeo, who joined us in different locations of BIENALSUR 2019, a Mexican artist you all know, Maria Willis, a Colombian curator. She now is the director of art of the Bank of the Republic of Colombia, and logically so, Diana Weschler, the artistic and academic director of BIENALSUR. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Aníbal Josami, the general director of BIENALSUR. I'd like to thank in special the institution and the team of sign interpreters who are enabling this to be transmitted to the deaf community. So we have found a possibility to incorporate a new audience so that this meeting is more accessible for all. And I'd also like to thank all the team members of UNTREF and BIENALSUR. UNTREF, the National 3 de Febrero University that is host of the BIENALSUR. And I should re-emphasize that in spite of the pandemic we are going through, the university that I'm honored to direct and run has virtually so kept running almost the entirety number of students, both undergraduate and graduate students, and they are parallelly working very actively with national, provincial and municipal governments by trying to cooperate from the public university in what can be done in order to mitigate the effects of pandemics. And of course, I'd like to thank the BIENALSUR team that keeps relentlessly working as if nothing had ever happened. This meeting was actually planned with a larger format, with the one that we called Global South, with massive turnout and with a great turnout of participants that would have been carried out last March. But because of this situation, it wasn't possible for us. We are doing so amidst these pandemics. It causes us to have to take action in a different manner. Before the meeting with some participants, we were pondering, on the one hand, on the possibility of trying to keep eye contact on the screen, but on the other side, we said that the whole situation is kind of strange. It is strange, it is odd not to be able to meet up and embrace one another, but we have to have an understanding that it is not strange for there to be a pandemics like this around the world, because the 21st century, in hardly 20 years, had 3 major sanitary crises with lots of death, with a high death toll in each and every one of them. We're not talking about black swans or things that are out of the blue. And this is the consequence of an outrageous predator capitalism that caused levels of inequality and social differences and cracks that are unimaginable in a world like this, additionally to the ecological disasters, and it all relates to why we have a situation as the one we are living through. And the most serious thing of all might be that these pandemics that will largely increase all these inequalities, the main repercussion, additionally to the health effect in itself and the misfortunate outcome of death and sick people, will deepen on the social inequality. So why BIENALSUR at this point in time and amidst this problem? I would say that it is because we are a global project based in Latin America. We were born by late 2015. That is when we became visible in the process of construction of the first Bienal in 2017, then in the second 2017, and in the 2019 edition. We should wonder, why is it right or fit for us to keep going, and why is it fit for us to have the first BIENALSUR 2020 meeting? I would say that with resilience, the resilience we are capable of having, those who don't have that many resources, but very many almost utopic ideals, consider BIENALSUR an instrument in contributing to the exercise of the right to culture to the great majorities, and also as something that enables to hear the voices of different postures in the framework of the big central museums in the world, by trying to overcome in art the difference between center and periphery. This is why we are in those museums, and parallelly we can also be, as we have been so far in the two editions, in towns and Aboriginal communities in South America and Africa, in institutions with different abilities in Lima, in the community of harbor works in Cerro Lama, Valparaíso. We can also become very much of an instrument of the process of friendship and friendship consolidation between Colombia and Venezuela in the San Simon Bolivar bridge. Or we can also be in Saudi Arabia by promoting the cultural integration between the Arab world and the Western world, and promoting the female liberation in Saudi Arabia. For those reasons, we believe that the way to generate and bring the audience together, generating a BIENALSUR community in 5 continents, is possible, because we believe that the world we are living in and the right to culture should replenish humanity in others. And I'm taking away a phrase from Diana Weschler on this. We are increasingly like that. And as I said before, there will be increasing differences because of the effects of this lockdown. It is fitting for BIENALSUR to keep going, and this is why we are here, trying to develop collective thinking that will help us after the pandemics not to go back to the pre-existing situation, but rather through a number of different actions to attempt to modify the world of art and culture by trying to incorporate the great majorities. Whatever we can do in this sense, along these lines, will be very forthcoming, not just for the world of art and culture as a sector of social activity, but also for the world as a whole. I believe that by way of introduction, this would be enough. So I'd like to ask Diana Weschler to give her thoughts on this introductory remarks so that we can then trigger the dialogue. Thank you, Aníbal. Going back to a number of issues that you were commenting initially, so in your opening remarks, and something that promoted the call out for this meeting is resisting to having to think about this as a normal. I'll go back to how abnormal this discipline of these triangles or squares we are bound to. We are confined to give classes, to celebrate birthdays, to develop collective projects. This is not normal. We cannot align our eyesights to others because bodies are not present, because we have some sort of imaginary abyss between those who are behind the screen and those who we believe are listening to what we have to say. BIENALSUR is a community. BIENALSUR is the other. It's being together. And for that reason, this is the best possible way we can make it happen given the context we are at. But much at the same time, it is a gesture of resistance that will help us think about prospective futures, possible futures. And along those lines, in this meeting, we believe that, especially in the first section, we would like to invite to comment, each and every one of you, from your perspective, which your position is, considering our critique to normality, to quote-unquote normal. This could happen, And I mean, those of us who have been reading texts and expositions from the very beginning of this has been one of the recurrent ideas. The worst thing that could ever happen is to go back to quote-unquote normality. So, centering our thoughts on the world where we are living today, this micro world, the field of culture, I mean to say, is that we should reivindicate this because we look for working and keep underpinning what we have. And I'd like for us to initially, so in the meeting, to make this round where you will, from your perspective, talk about how you are critical of this normality, so to speak, and from institutions as well, because of course there's this array of texts that is being created on different scenarios, and they recur on a number of topics, such as the touristicization of the world of art, vanalization, or of course blockbuster type of exhibitions. I'm not that sure about that either. And of course, we can agree on the fact that this is not the end of the circle of art. This is not just the phenomenon. At least so, this is not the mainstream problem everywhere. I'm sure that this is not the case. So without any further ado, I'll give the floor to our colleagues for them to open up the fire. We'll circulate the floor in the first round in order for us to have some sort of possible dialogue within this situation where we are controlled by these rectangles, and something that never happens in a dialogue is the image of oneself thrown back at us. So Ticio gets the floor. Maybe so, what has been pointed out as a situation of rarity and being scary will kind of give us a number of questions, future telling of what may be happening. Maybe it's too soon for us to do so. I mean, to analyze this time devoid of what is having, and maybe the future is right on top of us, and it may have already happened. But the thing is that we are not keeping the sufficient distance. But I mean, there are so many predictions, so many positions of forecasting into the future in a time at which we need to try to understand and to strengthen our position so we understand what is going on. This is too sudden and too unexplained for. So it is only understandable, arguably so, from the more optimistic positions down to the more pessimistic ones, from the thought that with this is the end of capitalism, or to those who say that capitalism will grow strengthened out of these situations, from the fact that society will also come out with a lesson learned, or reimagining things, or worse positioned in given situations. Chances are that what will happen in this dawn, we don't really know how the dawn after the lockdown will be like, but it might oscillate among many of these positions. That's probably the case. It won't be stepping on any of the extremes. Extremes are necessarily apocalyptic, and they are terrible in terms of their proportions and dimensions. At a point where the entire world is at the same time the protagonist and the audience of what is happening, generates instability and this kind of feeling that is not nice but nasty, actually. And the need to see this phenomenon as a whole. At the point, there are 4 billion people who are at a lockdown as estimated, but the number of people who will simply not have lockdown conditions because they have a house, they might not get delivery, they may not be able to ask from the pharmacist or to bring them something home, situations of crowded living, such as in jails or in refugee camps or in neglected ethnic groups, favelas, chabolas, etc. This gives us an indication that this is part of what we are living through, and this opens up to the number of remarkable people who die out of starvation in the world, far bigger than those who are currently living or dying from COVID. And this leads us not to minimize our look on the issue. We should put it into perspective. This situation will surely worsen in its adverse figures because of this phenomenon. So it's a matter of predicting. We could depart on a number of issues that we have in place. We all talk about rethinking about the need for change, rethinking how we are going to change, what for, in what direction, etc. Even when that is so, our feeling is that our prognosis, our prophecies will be futile, greatly so, but we are forced to thinking about them. We have to give a name to whatever is surpassing the bounties of any possible name. We are forced to imagining. More than ever, we are talking about a path into imagination. In Lacanian terms, the real unthinkable is absolutely irrepresentable. But for imagination, a path is opened up. We can start imagining possibilities. We can start imagining scenarios. This is what I wanted to say for an opening remark, and then go back to art, but in a second round, in another participation. Who would like to follow? Maria? I have you next to him. This is based on the screen order, and as I say, we are the new pixels on the screen. Is my voice coming through? No. Yes or no? Yes, we can hear you. One of the interesting remarks as an opening perspective is how to manage to think amidst this anguish, this collective sad moment and personal sad moment that is meant by uncertainty, and how to be able to adapt from an institutional perspective and from such a perspective where, additionally from others, we should think how to relearn communication. More than ever, communication has become important, and redefining on it. This is the biggest challenge in a museum as the museum director and for the society as a whole. What's good is thinking about the structure of the museum, and you think about society. It has to do with rules and regulations and how outdated are the regulations we were living by as a society. Even thinking about the museum practices, how far or how well were we working in narratives or rhetorics that may not be as effective this day and age. And this will help us reflect on a number of things, not just regarding physical regulation, physical distancing, but also the way we can think about narratives, historical narratives, and what can happen, what can help us have a period in the sentence, tool as an essential tool. It's very difficult for us to think in what will happen immediately when we are being a society that moves about with certainties. But this is a big challenge where we are at, and I believe that this type of platforms, such as BIENALSUR, I thank for its existence. They do have an experience working in a network manner. We in Colombia have a long way to go learning from it, and this will be very important. But of course, this issue of social distancing, fear, and how to rebuild trust. So, well, regulations on the one hand will have a number of things. Paradoxes are hard here because on the one hand we have to generate regulations with new trust, which has to do with very strict regulations. On the other, having the law enforcement authority, but then recovering humanity. So how can we reinvent ourselves as a society with new regulations, because the ones in the past didn't really work, but it shouldn't be too authoritarian or restrictive. These are my reflections so far. Humanity, contemporary humanism, and how we redefine it is part of the question that is at the foundation of all this. Before I give the floor to whomever would like to follow next, I'll mention something that we should have mentioned before. Those who are willing to participate with comments or questions, please write to encuentros@bienalsur.org so we can check the email and we receive questions, and then I'll take care of sharing comments or questions with the team. So again, encuentros@bienalsur.org. Would Manolo like to follow? Thank you. I'd like to add the following. I don't think anything will look the same. There will be changes. There will be a new normal in any case. And we have to talk about a number of things. There are voices that talk about war, fighting this sort of enemy. The word in itself, war, is very dangerous, of course, because it looks for an external enemy, and we all know how we deal with enemies, and because it hides something. It's a failure of the system, and this is something that we have to have a clear understanding of. It is failure, ecological failure. The pandemics now is not that different from Australian fires. Hurricanes. Human beings have become very small, and with virus we are very frail. So there are two elements. And we also have to think that it is quite evident, especially in countries such as Spain and Italy, or now that we are in Madrid, we have been very hardly hit by the pandemics, those who are unprotected, those who have no home, who are not part of statistics, and the elderly, those that have suffered a number of deprivations. And they are in the hands of companies for which what is important is benefit rather than old age. There could be a new normal. I don't know whether this should scare us or not. And remotely communicated normality, and the working class, those that have worked for those many years, those who are not in a generation that are part of this sort of precarious working conditions, we are afraid. And maybe new normal will aim at a society that will in and of itself look for more control, that we in a way will have it here. We talk about the balcony Gestapo, the police or the neighbor that takes note of those who are doing something different, and democracy. But learning plays a lot. Of course, you learn with others. You learn in a shared environment. You learn without being afraid of others. And therefore, it is essential for us to take into consideration this aspect. It very much depends on us. Should we go back to a new normal, or should we go back to something else? If we should go to something, we first have to survive. Being in a society that is very precarious, many of the artists have no work. In art, the same as in society happens. There is 1% that accumulates everything. So will there be a Marshall Plan? Will there be a plan so that things will look in a different way? But will we survive? How about the survival element? It is important for it to happen right now. And we should highlight it. And it's important to highlight the fact that we either live together without fear of others, Or we could have an issue, a problem. I have some proposals of how I imagine, how I see the future. Well, it's not the future. A long time ago, those of us behind the screen and many people were complaining, were challenging a system that was not sustainable, ecological, or democratic. It was ruled by the elites. This is quite difficult, as well as Washler was saying. When the machine is up and running, you get your hand cut. What looked impossible for us, well, has stopped by the system. There is a possibility. The possibility has always have to be political and ethical, and it depends on us if we are allowed to. It depends on what we do right now. And beyond proposals, we can discuss them later on, and I'd like to share them and discuss it with you. I do believe that there are three elements that have to be essential here. First off, technology is out there to get democratized. Technology has gone through a number of phases. From the 90s, net art that would almost get framed, digital art where we thought that through the web we could do a number of things. We have moved on to Facebook and Google, and this new class Mackenzie Ward calls the class of the Victorians by opposition, and those who live in a precarious conditions. It continues to exist, and there is a possibility to democratize the network. There won't be a technological solution. Solutions will always have to be ethical, but technology can always play a role. What matters is three aspects. On the one hand, the relevance of care, especially after the pandemics, the care of health, physical and mental health, the importance of solidarity. On the other hand, ecology. It is evident that we either change or we will be doomed to a sixth extinction. And finally, I'm a curator, accidentally, so all my life I have been a director, but what I like to do is exhibitions. Exhibitions will be out there, but the model of production will change. Marco Barabal, when he criticized the Bienal, he said that rather than visiting exhibitions, you will have to live in them. This is a different pace. This is not global or ultranational, but something else. And I leave it standing there for the time being. Thank you, Manolo. Betsabe, you are next to Manolo. This lockdown, in and of itself, I think, has been a very different experience at a class level, at a country level, where there are such large numbers in informal economies, at least so in Mexico. There is this culture, there is disenchantment or disappointment with science and with statistics and with politics. I mean, all environments that seemingly can help us some sort of certainty of the external outlook we are living through are all cracked down, and they have lost the confidence or the trust on the part of those who are living through this situation. It's not clear. I mean, in Mexico, yesterday, more than ever, we have reached the peak, the highest peak. This is so in Latin America as a whole, but especially in the city of Mexico. They say that we are having 17 times more death people, or 20 times more sick people than what statistics claim. So there is lots of uncertainty. We are far from any certainty, and from the side of culture and from my own practice, what I have discovered is that in no sci-fi movie on pandemics that I watched has this been approached. I mean, no experience of waking and mourning, how to deal with death, how there is no goodbye, how circles are not completed. Really and symbolically speaking, the approach of how to accompany the mourning, the wake, in a human manner is something that is very concerning. And I think it is quite difficult to do this from the white cube. We have to reinvent ways to meet, to re-meet the public space, meeting the other, physically speaking, I mean. I would wait. My only hope is that as we have lived through, and as Annibal said, this is not the first pandemics that we have gone through in the last century. I hope an antidote comes out, and if it does get created, we will have to exercise the muscle of meeting. We are close to that, and it would be terrible if we would endorse a fear, if we would bias a fear. Fear paralyzes. Fear keeps the power of many appalling systems, politically speaking. I believe that art should always be on the side of resistance, to speed, to not recognizing the other that has grown bigger or more powerful. And I even think it is important that not just a protection or measures and regulations should come from high technology. I believe that there's a lot to find again in popular culture and in the art that is also crafted with hands. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you, Isabel. And now the screen changed. I'll invite you, Volupa, to take part to celebrate this BIENALSUR meeting. You put it in perspective, and it's not because you two are here, Diana or Annibal, but my experience before this extended concept of Bienal not just being the open show of how a piece of art is produced where the audience goes and meets up with it. Bienal could be a system of meeting and dialogue extended over time among people. I would like to thank again BIENALSUR at this level. As Diana was saying, this is the level we have, the possibility, the digital possibility. It is easier in a certain way. Of course, we lose our bodies, but bodies, we have lost them over time. This hasn't actually happened only with pandemics. Many of the technology experiences on social media should make us reflect in terms of this double nature in our bodies. And on the other hand, I was thinking about two things as I was listening to you. I was thinking that without a doubt, the world before pandemics wasn't such a remarkable world. We didn't like it that much. We have been critical of it. We have been very strongly critical of it. We suffered from it in its different levels, actually. And therefore, pandemics, as an ethical and reflective experience, has been an opportunity to stop producing. I actually believe that in Chile we had an experience that had come from months before. We had this social riot, a very strong one of the biggest historical manifestations and demonstrations we've had in the last 50 years after the return of democracy, and society was at a standstill at that riot. However, we were a collective body that was taking up the streets. We changed these collective meetings that were highly creative, political, violent, confusing, and traumatic in their own rights. And we suddenly changed it due to pandemics where we had to get isolated. In many cases that was voluntarily so, except for what you have already warned, people that cannot stop from work because they have a precarious working condition. This doesn't only have to do with poverty, but with precarious labor systems they are part of, additionally to poverty, people who are worked on a monthly who are paid on a monthly basis based on what they do for a living. So in Chile, we psychologically changed our approach from a situation in which we were politically paralyzed in very massive manifestations and demonstrations. The last one was by females. That was very massive, plus 1 million people on the streets. And immediately after, we were forced to go on a lockdown to try to survive, to not to contaminate one another, in a situation of weakness in the trust we have for our governors, for the ruling class. As Betsabe was saying, there is distrust in what the ruling class delivers as information and as a tool for you to see what you do in these pandemics. This replicates with a very strong unstructuring of our government. We had been going through this for the few months before this happened. As a result of this polarity, we are living as a society in subjective terms. I experienced it myself with calm, as if this standstill would be something that gives us an opportunity to reflect, to go into the inside, to introspect. It helps us protect ourselves, and I say so in political terms. In Chile, we had been living through a lot of exposition to violence, and whenever we would go to the streets, it would be very dangerous. So going in the inside, going into an inside, going back to the inside of houses, shows the political struggle that was out there. And I didn't experience this with so much nostalgia, maybe not so far. I mean, this type of meetings, this happened to me while putting together lessons. I've had the feeling that this type of meetings will remove hierarchies from conventional hierarchies, social codes, racial codes, codes of genders. And even when I'm talking to myself, I'm in my bedroom, I'm in a quiet situation for me, and I feel very much like I'm talking to myself. This helps me experience you in a more horizontal manner. This happens to me while I deliver my lessons as well. I have greater concentration in each of the and every one of those that take the floor and talk. I found new ways of respect. I've seen it in my kid going to school, new manuals of practice and online lessons, how to establish respect among people so we can listen to one another, and how to establish dialogue through these dematerialization or decorporization, so to speak, where bodies are removed. And I see it as an interesting stage for reflection. What is quite calling, quite strongly so, and with this I will be wrapping up on my first idea before we move on to art. We should be discussing extensively about art. It's interesting that the world decided to stop, to take a halt. I was thinking about a piece that is called, it's just a title actually, The Year Where We Didn't Want to Die. Because modernity is full of areas of sacrifice in its full 400 or 500 years of existence. Racial sacrifice, geopolitical sacrifice, areas of ecological sacrifice, activism that has led us to situations that are quite extreme with a lot of inequality. And nonetheless, never had we been able to put things on hold, to halt. And in this desire of stopping, I feel it as a very strong historical change. I know that there is the political dichotomy between stopping or sustaining economy. Even in political terms, there are groups who defend to contaminate each other again and to keep underpinning economy. And there are groups who ideologically so defend stopping and halting altogether. But there is a global situation where everyone is at the same time in the same situation. And this is interesting in an analytical kind of sense. It's as though it would be a big world, global experience where we all are in our diversities living through the same situation and witnessing the show simultaneously on how different decisions are made in different countries, who are the more effective leaders, who lie more, who lie less, how many people died in Mexico or in Santiago, in Buenos Aires or in the United States. This global show is, as an analytical situation or psychological situation, an intellectual situation, looks like a phenomenon of which we will be talking lengthily, because culturally speaking, it has a very strong relevance, a very strong weight, and we won't go back to normal quickly, because I take it that this has transformed us, such as educational systems have been transformed, very quickly transformed by this. Even when we may go back to classes, we will go back with a different experience that will be incorporating without pandemics, but it'll be a possibility. It'll be a plus rather than a negative. That's what I wanted to say. Eduardo, the last in the first round. Yes, I was listening to Ticio in the beginning when he took the floor, and to all of you. There's lots of things that are triggered as a result, but the image where we are at is like a shock. A shock. I was listening to, or I was reading to something that a writer wrote, and she somehow was depicting this moment as if we had been talking about having had a super impact or a collision, as if you would be in your car after having been collided, where you have to put your thoughts straight to think how to keep going. It's a very strong point of collapse with lots of levels. The fact that this is contemporary and simultaneous around the world is very strong, and much at the same time you recognize that there are kind of islands where life continues as normal, towns or villages. It is international but not global, not entirely. This happens in towns, in cities. A very strong distance will be generated between metropolis and the rest of places. I mean, cities became very dangerous, aggressive places, and in a way, I believe that one of the effects of this collapse is, well, it will localize, it will remove the crowds. I believe that the format that BIENALSUR has is quite reactive to this, as if something had been adopted that has become necessary, going to places rather than crowding. We had everything planned for that to happen. Well, this is the advertising part of it. I believe there is some major uncrowding, more domestically speaking. This happens when we stay at home. In the first few weeks you go crazy, you start going over the checklist and you see how much you have. I wasn't able to go back to my workshop, to the studio, so you go to the rooms at home to find materials that were left. If we were able to extrapolate this domestic action to something social, it would be very powerful. I mean, having to activate on communities, whatever is there, local resources, there will be some strong relocalization movement. I don't live in town, I live out of town. I commute, and that is not that necessary. My workshop is downtown, and I go there commuting for 2 hours on a daily basis. We reconsider the use of energy, the use of time, how to go back and put things in order. Resources, basically. I mean, as Volpa was saying, we were at a speed and we hadn't even thought about the need. It was some sort of modus, a demand or producing that is quite challenged this day and age. And in terms of art, this is very strong. It's a slap in the face of artists, because we all had this feeling and the need to have some sort of organization. There is some sort of lack of protection of the role of artists in the world of art. That had already been underscored. I believe that we could somehow underpin it because there are social links. We get together every week in 3 exhibitions, and this gives you some sort of sense of feeling or familiarity, where a strong community is generated. But in social and governmental terms, or in terms of assistance, well, it fails today. There is no sufficient aid or assistance, nor are there any organizations that can demand them very specifically. A friend told me yesterday that an organization was being put together in Argentina with artists, but so far they got referred to standard type of assistance, as if we weren't able to have a place of our own. Every organization manages things from their place, but then we go to the generality of things. We don't exist as a subject. So this could very much accelerate that. This will be a process accelerator. This appears in connection to what we were talking about before, technology or a body, a human body. I believe that even though technology pops up as the big communicating element, we all start feeling nostalgic for meeting, and we had been losing it already. It will be a catalyst of things that were actually happening. All this first round is quite interesting because there are a number of issues that converged. Each and every one of you added your perspectives. There is an issue that got repeated in each and every one of you, the issue of time, and precisely so we have chosen to share this time, but we cannot share the space. So the situation between technology, real and virtual, is present all the time. And there are a number of issues. And so we can align and get more focused on the field we reivindicate as our place of action in the world. We all need to be activists in the world of art, the space of art, because we believe that there's the right to culture, to contribute, to render culture visible, and art in particular. We can have signs, or we can overexpose the roles of the system and contribute in that happening. And because we believe lots of things that will put us back into perspective. And I was thinking about this statement by Voluspa in connection to stopping, halting, this will to stop. And this is something on which we talked a lot in the last few days, and no one could really imagine this. It is true and it is not true that the world is at a halt. And in culture, while everything was stopping, and I talk about the spaces where we present Untref, but I believe that this includes all that we have been reading, spaces, public-private spaces, with their exhibitions that are ready, that had not been inaugurated. So I believe, well, this happened to us. We had a sequence between a Wednesday and a Thursday where we announced that we would open but not inaugurate, and we would have more staggered type of visit guidelines to avoid high concentrations of people. And on the next day, we had announced the closure and the non-inauguration. And at the same time, how we were thinking how to take to the audience those pieces, those projects that we had carefully selected. These should be, I mean, in all the venues we had female artists who had never presented in Argentina. It was very scheduled and very cared for, as we had been doing things. We took the time to think about them, and they are there at the lockdown, in spaces where no one has access to. This replicates enormously, and together with this, we started seeing situations that have to do with the consideration that Eduardo was saying in connection to what is necessary, what becomes necessary in this context, what is necessary as connected to Betsabe's statement. Is it high-tech? Is it what will be ruling? Or should we check upon another number of practices that are part of this balance, so to speak, or of this time to read between the lines? I liked this image of going and looking into the bedroom or the room where something may have been left behind from the time where you had your office at home. And there was this graffiti that circulated electronically on the media. You may have all seen it because it was published in several languages. If you think that artists are necessary, try to spend this lockdown without poems, music, and narratives. This amidst a moment where, given the need to take care of life, I mean, the year where we didn't die, everything seems not to be important. And in our environment, as Eduardo was saying, artists feel they have no space for their own. They have to go look for other guilds or other unions, so to speak, other associations. Nonetheless, culture at some point contributes to keeping mental health, if we talk about health. And social sciences are the ones that are contributing to being able to think about what is happening with us. So, well, this is trying to integrate this partly with us. And I'd like to finish by saying a number of things that have to do from what the audience has said. And I am glad, because this confirms that there is an audience on the other side, present bodies that we can smell and see, even though we cannot physically do so. Not only do we have an audience, but there are people who via WhatsApp say that they can see us crystal clear, and at this time and age that can make us pretty happy, actually. Well, there are a number of issues that I'll be reading quite quickly so we can use them as a trigger, so we can go to the second section that brings us into the perspective that we all have from art and what we imagine. And then I go back to what Ticio had to say in connection to imagination, because I believe that no one is thinking about defining the few next steps to take, but rather saying, well, now we have routed our life distantly, so let's reshuffle. Museums are working digitally, we are imagining auditoria and seeing images that have to do with questions like the one that I have just received. What is the role of art in this context where there are 4 billion confined people and deprivation among them? How do we imagine that these curatorial spaces, the new curatorial spaces, or these spaces for new museums, in this new scenario that we are envisioning, in the extent that lockdown will be overcome, will play? They also ask about what we think as future in connection to the relation between art and regulation. And on this, I'd like to add the last comment before I give the floor to whomever would like to get started with the second round. In what kind of way should we think to keep crossing borders so that we won't be giving up on these projects that help us work between the local demands and the porous nature of a system that shows us the difference. It invites us to live in differences. This is an element that I believe is not a minor one. Losing the possibility of meeting up with somebody else, different, with another production with which I have no keys, and I need to understand the culture so I can understand the keys to read. So a number of issues that have to do with timelines are established. Rethinking the artistic and the aesthetic experience. Where has this been left in this accelerated timeline that we had been working, or where things had been working? A number of levels of artistic institutions. This shouldn't either be generalized because it doesn't encompass them all. Who would like to take the floor? I think at the level of art, with all ambiguities in the field, a number of different levels happen. The collapse of institutionality in mainstream, conventional in general, and its traditional system of museums and biennials, and traditional biennials, so to speak, communications, critiques and whatnot at a certain point in time. And of course, it's not uniform. Hegemony gives space to differences and to resistance, internal resistance, to games of resistance. And, well, the more conventional system doesn't work. It has stopped, as has been the case all over the world. And it is rethinking. The first one has to do with the internet galactics. And it's all right. This is what we have handy, and this proves to work for communication purposes. So museums, online meetings should happen the same way. This is definitely plausible, to use these means we have to overcome this lack of communication, the paralysis that surrounds us. This is on the one hand. And then rethinking at all levels how imagination comes to play in an alternative sort of manner, showing art, exhibiting art, communicating with artists, with one another, in alternative institutions or other ways to meet up that are actually very difficult, because they have to be done without a physical audience in almost all the countries. This is on the one hand. This is kind of paralyzed. It is kind of injured, damaged immediately. So it's a matter of imagining alternatives or issues that have to do with different ways of circulating, other circuits or alternatives, a very strong creation that happens. I mean, there's lots of artists, lots of them, that are strongly creating in their confinements. And they are creating based on a number of social communication alternatives, alternatives to reach different audiences, connecting with the first issue. But there is creation. The aspect of creation is a very strong one, and there is an aspect of dissemination that is very strong, and this leads to this possibility of banalization. I mean, museums are full of jokes, games, Van Gogh and Dalila playing games, and there's a lot of banalization. This need reaches all corners, and without sacralizing art or making it something totally separate, it should be the repository of questions, the repository of a number of intensity. To be able to interrogate about the sense without the grandiloquence that modern art may have had, and with this death or demise of art, where art loses its glimpse or its aura and the transcendental characteristics that underpinned it. There is banalization, touristicization, so to speak, of art. And I'm just saying that this happens. I'm not trying to scare you away with it, but we have to think about the possibilities to keep up some aspect of art as a teller of social questions and as a spoiler to looking for significances and meanings that are more complex. We also have this issue of institutionalization. With art, it is quite difficult to plan ahead, because if you take it that for art, you will require mobilization, subjectivity, desire, and conscious to take it and to re-elaborate this immense complexity internally. How are we going to manifest such a thing? I'm talking about this type of more serious manner of conceiving art. Of course, there is art based on theme, and of course on the sense of opportunity. Of course, there are people who are drawing art with people with face masks or piled corpses. Of course, we have to deal with this issue, but we have to take a distance from it, rather than putting an anchor on this desperate need to express what happens right here, right now, or good intentions, desire, the desire we all have to have access to correcting some excesses in the world. At any rate, I believe Betsabe said that resistance has to always be a shape of art. I cannot conceive of art when it is not critical. I cannot conceive of art if it does not take distance to the establishment. It's not just a matter of demonstrating or protesting. It remains clear that art, through its own rhetoric, through irony and through reflection, and through how it makes its formal mechanism more complex, it can start having a number of positions that keep challenging things, the status quo. This is art. It's not a matter of answering all these questions, but in making it resonate with other spaces. This is the biggest driving force. By simplifying things at a macro-political level, I see it easier, the struggle of organizations, how to assume the moment where art recovers or fights for institutionality that has to do with professionalizing its own space. Politically speaking, it is far more complex, and I don't think we can immediately get to see how it'll be expressed or manifested. I refer to how a number of experiences will have to get intensified. There is this burden of a scare, of insanity, of bittersweet feelings, and how this will exacerbate injustices around the world. We are always getting to see the intensification, especially now, of one aspect in particular, but the broad spectrum of what has to do with deep inequality in a system is something that might not be on the board, but it'll be more intensified, probably so, with the demise or the collapse, the devastating situation that we have to live through. Thank you. I give the floor to you, but I'm mesmerized with how many questions we are getting and with how many comments we are receiving and how many endorsements we are receiving, to the possibility of joining this meeting the way we are allowing people to. This goes down, is in line with what we have been discussing so far. Let me introduce one of the questions that was asked. In this context, how do we imagine the aesthetic experience, and how will it be for a while vis-a-vis the piece of art? This is in line with the comment that you've made, and I'm sure that out of the notes that are being taken by people, we will get to exchange more. So did you want to follow? Maria, I wanted to connect it to what Ticio was saying. This is forcing us to equality that was long necessary. And I believe it is key to see that on these pandemics, we are being forced to having to walk to how the structures of power are in crisis. I'm sorry about that, but it is wonderful. The model affairs had to be in crisis as well, or how exhibitions are programmed or biennials. There are a number of things that have to do with privilege in the creative experience that I believe can be rethought and rescheduled. And I was just thinking, and I would think that Ticio could comment what his thoughts are. I was engaging in a conversation with a person who manages a platform of Aboriginal creation, and they said, I'm interested in regaining shapes where creativity will not give privileges to the best, but through the very good should give privileges to a network of artists, because this is how creativity works in the group of native people. It's not like the star or the best. And along those lines, I engaged in dialogue with an artist who had a self-managed space in Colombia that is called Miami. Well, it sounds funny, but it's the Miami in Bogota. And she said, this is the way we work. We are a mutual support platform. And I wanted to say right here that these micro-policies of doing the self-managed spaces contemporarily by artists in urban spaces, I hope could get replicated, and I hope the public arena could try to see how they can approach them and work in that manner, or at least so support them, because, as we were saying, it is difficult to think what the museum has to be like. We, of course, are bound to do so, but it would be wonderful to create thought platforms that will be very much approached to the flourishing in self-management spaces that will always survive. I mean, they have proven to survive, even in periods of scarcity. So this way of reinventing, well, we have a lot to learn from them on their part. In connection to the question of the presential nature, I definitely believe, from my own perspective as a curator, I never would like to privilege an experience that is limited to this screen. In the museum, we have tried to incentivize workshops at houses that families are brought together, rather than being in front of a screen, working together, generating possibilities of meeting and being in a community. There is this issue of redefining and rethinking the community as a whole and how to be together even when we might be separated. I hope we can reinvent ourselves and invent programmings where we can reach houses with wonderful content, with content for confinement, and even when confinement is and comes to an end, we don't really know whether this will happen in a second wave. So offering possibilities to create at the house in confinement, and I hope that they will always be thought in terms of a new presential approach. This experience requires social contact and contact with a piece of art. That will never change. And I was reading at some special publication that was issued by El País in Spain. I mean, the body needs to be there and see. The body cannot be removed from the places it should like to go to. And this is my reflection so far. The only thing that will save us is art. This was just to make a remark and to keep talking about problems or unanswered questions to what Ticio had to say. Cultural development from now on cannot but be local and global at the same time, and this makes us face to another problem: how to be global, where we cannot even walk away from our homes, much less can we go to other countries and to think about things in other countries. And based on what Maria had to say, and as she referred to the El País supplements, many of us may have read through it. There was this Canadian geographer, or French, I don't recall right now, who talked about something that is not any news for us: the increasing disappearance of middle class, and finally the development of art that has been based on these middle classes, along the years. So it's just a way of introducing two new elements for our discussion. Before I give the floor to someone else, I'd like to introduce an issue here that the audience brings about. It's Nicole Costa, an anthropologist. She asks whether we would be interested in moving forward in the relationship between center and periphery art museums, not the ones that exist, but how would we imagine them post-pandemics, and what the possibilities are for museums and art on peripheries. I just leave it standing. Voluspa asked for the floor. I wanted to go back to the audience question, the idea of the aesthetic experience, and I was thinking about this bodily parenthesis, so to speak. And oddly enough, it forces us to think about the body. This critical distance is very interesting. Things that we had taken for granted, or experiences that we had taken for granted, we have to rethink about them. Well, mourning, waking, when on earth could have we imagined having to say goodbye to a loved one without being presentially there, without being present? That rethinks everything radically, because not being able to carry out the wake ritual is an overwhelming and appalling experience. It's surprising because we take it for granted. So along those lines, I believe that the aesthetic experience, what pandemics gives us, what this situation of physical distancing, it's not social distancing. We should make some difference here. What we are doing here is a social meeting. Our bodies are not engaged in the same space, but at least so we are sharing something that is temporary, where we are getting together, and there are a number of things. And there are a number of people watching us. We don't know how many they are. We cannot see their faces, but we know they are out there, through questions and through how we imagine that others are listening to what we have to say. So this disaggregates on the experience, and this makes us kind of have the possibility to think about it from a different perspective. And I ask for permission to talk about this anecdote, even when I'm not going deep into the details of it, but it's quite encouraging. A curator was stopped in Santiago. This is the story. A non-Chilean curator, and as a result of the lockdown, was stopped in Santiago. When the lockdown started, he cannot leave the country. He called me. I don't know him. We hadn't met. And he said, would you like to have a conversation? I'd like to talk with you. I'm in Santiago at the lockdown. It's quite a singular situation. And I said, well, I'm at a lockdown at my house. I don't have much to do. Let's engage in conversation. And so we met on the screen. We were quite enthused. The enthusiasm of rethinking, because everyone in the beginning were quite paralyzed. At least so, had been quite paralyzed inside my domestic affairs. And he said, a curator friend of mine had a project in Berlin that has to do with this. It's a way of activating creation, but it's not rationally thought, not even as a strategy, but rather as a creative way of expression where people get connected. Do you think we could do this in Santiago? And I said, yes, of course. I mean, amidst the limitation we are having, our houses, the lockdown, being enclosed, time, we have a lot of time, as Eduardo was saying, and connection, connectivity. And he's been organizing a project that involves more than 60 people, and we will be doing this later on. And it's been, I mean, why do I say so? It's been quite repairing, so to speak. As Diana was saying, culture, well, what can you do? You read a book, you watch a movie, you listen to an article. I get nourished. This is what I can do, so I won't go crazy. But in terms of aesthetic experience, what can I do? I may contact somebody else, and I can do whatever I can do within the restrictions, the limitations, to see what happens. I mean, the result of the experiment, I mean, we won't know what it is all about, not today. We cannot define it today. But this has given us this feeling to share experiences and think about something through creation that gives us some sort of human valve, so to speak, where we can connect with one another. And I believe that this will be one of the relevant things in the aesthetic experience. I agree with the fact that never will we lose relations with the object, but it was overvalued as well, and we must admit to that in market terms, in the artist authorship, in terms of hierarchy and institutions, geopolitically speaking. I mean, I also believe that it is more important to focus on the ways to relate that will give us freedom and creativity, even within this restrictive situation, than an object. I believe it is more significant. And along these lines, as much as we can, we should keep connections and the feeling of sharing emotions and ideas with others in our own spaces, in our own limitations. This is a restriction that can be highly creative. It's not just a reflection. Well, it looks like K-Cherry piano. Based on what you were saying, she's the director of the Tucumán University. Inter alia makes a long comment, but she says she tries to imagine some sort of future file that could keep on a capsule all these experiences as a source of research and investigation on humanity in and of itself, on what the human experience is like, contemporarily speaking. And these type of relations and strategies are part and parcel of it. All these virtual meetings are recorded, and this, in a way, will be part of a capsule of some sort of file of the present moment, just so to quote the title of the journal that Annibal has been running for the last 30 years, and it is very much connected to this. I see that Manolo is writing so much that I'd like to give the floor to him. I would very much love to. Can you hear me well? Well, first of all, I'd like to talk about doubts and a number of things in connection to what has happened. The crisis of biennials, and this is by an anti-biennial, sorry, Annibal. We also are convinced anti-biennialists. BIENALSUR is not a biennial. Well, I wanted to challenge or anti-fair or exhibition and all of that. I also believe that in this crisis, chances are that those that are on the bottom won't be losing anymore because they are already on the bottom. I mean, there is no hell on earth, so there cannot be anything worse than what they are on right now. Those on top in the power structure keep moving. We have to think out of 4 or 5 galleries that continue to do all sorts of activities. So what is being disappearing is the mid-tissue, the mid-mesh. Without demonizing fairs, exchange market or not, what happens with it? This is just a question that I share because it's my doubt. I would also show the difference between closed museums, but they are not at a standstill. As a matter of fact, it's Saturday, it's 6 p.m., and here we are. I don't know, I mean, my computer hasn't been that old, but how many Zooms in a few months? The Reina Sofia Museum is more active than ever, but it is active in a different type of way, and this activity is pretty mimetic of the activity that had already been in place and to the one we are used. The stupid meme kind of thing, things that appear on the internet, but when displacing things, of course, they look far more obvious. But let's not forget that does exist. I mean, in the world of art, it does exist. Museums are locked, but not stopped. When the confinement took place, a number of hyperactivity happened. Everyone had to send over videos, and we demonstrated something else. We started reproducing what we had already done. Precariousness, sending videos for free, of course. Who pays artists? Who pays curators? How are they paid? These type of ideas, I believe, are quite important. And on the other hand, in connection to whether digital or not, well, the digital will be there to stay. It'll expand and democratize, but of course it cannot suppress the object experience, the physical one. If we keep sneezing and coughing, we will be moving without coming too close in contact with others, but we will keep doing so. And when they return, there is an anachronistic element in them that will be fundamental. We will have to reinvent those spaces. And for sure, if we talk about what type of pieces, what type of art, I think that there is an essential element, enigma. Those questions that will only give the floor to other questions, decorative art or foolish art, and excessively discursive art, thematic art, where we know upfront what the results are going to be like. In connection to institution, I did want to highlight on a number of things. As I mentioned before, work over the long term. I believe that in the next 2 years, necessarily so, work will have to be done in the long term. There won't be any trips. It is necessary to use this productive model stopping to talk about the long term that will necessarily have to be collective. It'll have to be to coexist rather than to visit. And where one thing has to be learned, how to coexist, how to give importance to what I believe will be very relevant, care loved ones, and at the same time be critical in a way which is not the Western reason. And finally, something that has become evident with pandemics, it is not global or national. The peril of ultranationalism is out there. We do have it ubiquitously the neo-fascism peril is there. I mean, neo-fascism of kidnapping or sequestering our terms, our images, our vocabulary, and give it a turn, and then make it look like normal is out there. And institutions of culture have an important role to play, and it is not one thing or the other. And Donna Haraway term should be there. It's a situated knowledge, a situated museum, talking from a site. It is not local, but it allows you to work on different scales. Scales are the ones that will somehow help us create bridges between the self-managed collectives, the public institutions, and in this panorama where the middle class probably will the one be disappearing, generating bridges like this that will be fundamental and that will be an opportunity. This implies the biosphere, it implies the human being as such, and that change of scale will imply another term, extradisciplinarity. Let's not confuse it with interdisciplinarity of neoliberal Hatsu-Obis type of people. It's challenging on disciplines. It's making an ecological action, a political action, not because, I mean, an artistic action may be political without changing the rules of a museum, without having someone come along and denounce you, because this is not in the byproducts or in the bylaws of the museum. And this is essential as well in this context. Who would like to take the floor now?
No, sigue. Sigue, Eduardo.
I just wanted to talk about this idea where the strongest injury is by institutions. Artists have survival as a problem, but in terms of creative notions, art, in the best of circumstances, shakes up from very limiting structures we had in our race, the commercial race, the structures that are more embedded in the conventions of what doing art actually means. As this is so hardly hit, I mean, that format is so hardly hit, there's a lot of freedom that is generated, and it opens up sensors that you do have in your mind in order to try and understand where to keep manifesting, where to keep doing research. I believe that our work along those lines is not actually seen that affected, not in essential terms. We just see how it is modified. This energy is latent. It is ready to be used in a different direction. But it is true that all the institutions that demanded work from us, that organized our life and production, start to be in a crisis, and so we incorporate this. And where is it that we should start producing again without those demands? Manolo has something to say. I'll be very brief. I wouldn't say that institutions are the ones requesting, but it's the other way around. It's a way of being in the world in the collective conscious. I hope that this is the idea of the subject, the neoliberal abstract cold subject, the one that equals Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and the ones who have a parallel in the artist that looks for a race or a career, collectors, or the curriculum. I hope that this may be the part that is affected by the crisis. Well, we should have to see how permeable institutions are to those mandates. There are some that are more permeable, others that are less. but there are points of connection with one another between these two worlds. I just would relate it to these projects Voluspa was just talking about a while ago. We still don't know the format they are going to have, but this energy of production won't be lost. I mean, at any rate, we are trying to reorganize ourselves to see how and in what direction, but we will keep producing. And it is interesting to start perceiving the rumor of redefining what art is all about, what the new art is all about, what the new way to produce is going to be. It was highly connected to something that, at least for us, for our community, we have been very much exposed to the market, and this gives us some sort of relief. And at least so, it introduces a doubt. Aníbal said he wanted to talk. Two clarification remarks, beginning on what Eduardo said, the situation of artists that are so much conditioned by the market, and museums. With Diana, our experience is that of co-directing the five museums that are coded under MUNTERF, the museums of the National 3 de Febrero University. By reading the discussions in Europe among museum directors and institution representatives, we realized once again in periphery how this was like and how different those museums that are highly market-oriented from museums such as the ones we run, where our main concern is to come to new communities and incorporating new communities to the audience of museums, and that our concern doesn't have to do with the budget of the museum or the number of merchandising that gets sold. And on the other hand, because we are free of charge museums, totally free museums. So once again, and this will contribute more for this to go deeper, we notice, as is the case, the difference between center and periphery, and we may know how to manage this. And there might be some museums, such as Reina Sofia Museum, which is one of the big museums in the world, but with a directorship that is quite different from that of other museums. Well, surely they'll be able to go in this direction, how to reach the right balance, the point in the middle where instruments are no longer market instruments in order to become cultural instruments of society as a whole. And then this will get easier in a problem of artists, as Eduardo was saying, and Betsabe was saying as well. Betsabe has been asking for the floor for a while. It's a point where, in a way or other, confinement will be gradually be left behind. There are sequelae and new regulations. Before imagination and utopia will have normal economy regulating, it might be overcome or become more preponderant than health itself. One of the collapses was because it stopped being a human right and it became a privilege for those that could purchase insurance in systems such as in North America and whatnot. Such as health had to become present as a human right that has to be taken care of, because otherwise everything else collapses in the general way. Culture in its own right, as was seen in what El País published, has kept under confinement many people in a healthy manner. That will get more spaces to have hospitals, more ways to distribute health at home or outside from home in order to put an end to this disease. The sequelae of loss and of mourning and pain that this will involve will require culture in a very real, tangible manner. And these regulations maybe are not taking this too much into consideration. And I hope we can have, as artists and as institutions, imagination as to permeate this with the human cultural needs so that they get flexibilized, meaning to invent new ways to meet with one another in spaces and with bonds to other cultural paradigms, such as the Aboriginal people with their wisdom, with their way to understand nature and their relation with it, and with this opposition that happens between this extreme fetishism and individualistic consumption in the market of art, but also the vanalization, the mediatic vanalization of exhibitions on the media, on the social media, on the networks. In the middle, we have to permeate down the porosity level so we can find new places from which to exercise our practice. There is an aspect that has to do with access and circulation that may not be just the result of these sites that we already talked about, dump art or vain art. There's lots of museums. Our museum, for instance, since 2012 has carried out virtual visits. I mean, the exhibits are in virtual exhibits, such as in other platforms, as is the city of Buenos Aires. They got surprised we had that many, and we had done this right now, and it wasn't the case. It's another alternative. Having the chance, it's not to not be able to come down. Thinking about this, maybe everyone wants to go see Guernica, and when they see it, they get disappointed because it looks much nicer on the postcard or on their t-shirt rather than seeing the big mural without shine. Some people are satisfied with the postcard and others are not. And that's quite logical and respectable.
De Diego Radiboy, que fue el director general de Industrias Creativas de la ciudad y que, bueno, se quedó muy alineado en el primer planteo de Manolo.
Manolo's first consideration about the impossibility to stop where changes couldn't actually be done. So, for Manolo and for everyone else, the question is, now that the machine is finally stopped, what are the toward changes, the wanted changes? We keep imagining, we keep dreaming in order to go back to part of everything that was said. We keep thinking collectively, and we keep thinking about the situated museums, which is the space that Reina Sofia was granted when it got very quickly restructured in Manolo's leadership, or the Clarity or situated museum that could be seen in El Barro Museum, or the coexistence of past and present in the Banco de la República collections, or other ways to consider what is situated in the BIENALSUR ways, where we try to think with the local demand and with the proposals that come from very different spaces. This is why we ourselves expanded the international open calling that had been opened since February 15, because this was a demand from the collective international of artists and founders. Given the new reality, everybody is rethinking. Everybody wanted more time to send over their proposals. And of course, the timeline is yet open, is still open. Maybe Manolo would like to go back as a result of Diego's question. Or, well, Maria, she's raising her hand. The microphone is off. I just wanted to say that what is the museum that we imagine? We have talked about this many times, but I did wanted to say, as Betsabe said, the relevance of finding new places. One of the things that pandemics has proven is that there are spaces that are not private or public, that are not intimate or extraneous, so to speak. They are at some point in the middle. People had been doing things on balconies or on their cars. We are looking for new spaces. I believe that this is important to consider. I believe that a close possible future, in connection to what Eduardo and Betsabe were saying, all of a sudden we can start thinking about a museum as a place that can be supporting public entities, public agencies, to build, to rebuild citizen trust. I hope we can do so. Something hard is happening, such as your museums, Indiana and Animal. The Banco de la República Museum is free of charge, and going back to new normal, having to restrict entrance while we actually wanted to be democratic and open, is one of the enigmas that you have spoken about, because there are no clear answers. But this is one of the more painful enigmas. How come? I mean, how will it be democratic? There are people that can have access to masks, others who cannot. We have to reinvent this regulation. And as I say, I hope museums can have partnerships with artists and to creatively engage in these new regulations on citizen culture to regain trust, and so that these measures of control through art could be more candid and nicer. I believe that the museum should be some sort of a bridge between the needs to be very careful, caring for the others, but creativity is rendered for many things. In Germany, they are opening up, and I have seen how they are trying to create these new limitations between people in an artistic sort of way. So I believe I hope we could involve artists, get them on board, and then go back to museums, so that museums will truly be a model for citizens in the public space of what we are talking about. I had said so in another intervention. We are all reflecting upon this. Museums and institutions, walls in a way. We are already doing so with the virtual world. We are opening up. We have been doing so for a long time. How can museums bring these walls down and go to the public space to support this new, nicer, less restrictive sort of way? Manolo, you had asked for the floor before? No. And also, I loved what Manolo said, living in exhibitions, rethinking ourselves, well, will precisely be hand in hand with these new spatial coexistences, conceptual and coexistences, and then it won't be just an platform, but an experience, and that's wonderful and challenging. Many of us don't want it to be a window case, but in many cases it ends up being a window case. In highly massive museums, well, it looks like people rotate around the space, but this is not the idea. Ticio, amidst such a high level of pessimism and bitterness that this situation brings about, and without falling down in the space of encouragement, light encouragement, art has a broader sense. It has the vast possibility to be nourished from crisis, from tragedies, from limiting moments, because of creativity, because of imagination. And this can mean the possibility to, in a more audacious manner, to open up new paths, ways out, so to speak. One of the fundamental notions is trying to avoid new Manichaeisms. If we find a point in the middle between big museums and site museums, there are impressive experiences that have had a stock of alterness or otherness and openness. Reina Sofia is an impressive example, this vast museum that has a concern to open up to diverse alternatives. These are better prepared possibilities. The same is true with the museums that you run here in Buenos Aires with BIENALSUR. I don't just say so because you are in charge, but because these are the ones that I know from more closely, simply so. So the variety of solutions that we can have to reimagine as we are thinking, self-imagination, the necessary auto-imagination from this model up to something that Maria pointed out, the possibility to put an end to our suburb nature and look at other cultural models. It won't be the solution to everything, nor do they have to be exemplifiers, but they do have a stock of experience and of imagination that should be sufficient and a very important nutrient at this time. If we admit to the fact that a system has failed, all right then, let's take a look at what other systems, what other models can open up different paths and different experiences without demonizing cultures or without victimizing other cultures. Of course, there are lots of cultural models. Aboriginal people, one of them. Paying an attentive eye, as Maria is doing. I don't say that this will open up doors or pave the way for us, but it could open up small windows that can, in a way, give us a glimpse of hope where we can see possibilities. This is what we are desperately trying to do all together. Voluspa and Eduardo. Well, I was thinking about this idea of toward changes or desirable changes along the lines of Betsabé's, the processes of the artist. Well, maybe so in the creative process, and as Ticio was saying, the situations of crisis, these are very attractive situations because in a way, we work by resisting the hegemony, being critical of it, so seeing how we can radically find a change from what we have been so critical of, in a sense, comes in the direction of what we had already been thinking. So I believe that creative processes of taking a look into the world, being in this situation of looking into the world from this confinement, these creative processes start operating unconsciously so. But there is something to it where I get to see that our situation is affected, our creative situation is affected, This is how I think about it. This is how I live through it. It is the relationship with the other. When I talk about a relation with the other, I'm not thinking about how to relate with an institution, and I'm not thinking about the intermediary role that institutions have between artists or the piece of work by the artist and the audience. I'm just thinking about the following. How is it that when the audience is in this precarious situation at a lockdown, others are incommunicated? This drives us necessarily into thinking about how to think the other. When you have creative processes, the creative process is not just producing an object, it's a means to communicate with some other, and the other is the audience. They are the otherness. So this, in my mind, has been quite relevant to think about whether this communication, if it is not physical, bodily, or objectual, or experimental, meaning how to experience conventional reality, and if this relation is right now limited to a virtual space and we don't know for how long, this, in deep terms, means reflection beyond the fact that, well, of course, I understand and I believe that museums and all institutions and all institutional forms of contemporary art are thinking of themselves in this way. But inside our work as artists is to how and think about the other, how to think about communication with the other, the spectator, the audience, the public, beyond institutions, as a problem of the experience. I believe that this is a question that I tend to ask myself. I ask myself about this and other doubts that come to my mind as well. I'm not thinking about that many pieces of art. It's not that what I mean to say. I'm just saying what happens with this. How is that happening? How to look for the other. Ignoring the problem of institutions, because the problem of institutions, well, they for us are, as Eduardo was saying, they are kind of ambiguous. I mean, they show up a hierarchy, they show up a number of ways, they give a limitation of something that we see as a demand, but it is a restriction at the same time. In the case of how to make things work, how to make this dialogue, this creative communicational dialogue work with the other that you as an artist are looking for. I mean, this is a major question in my mind right now. I agree with that, with you on that one, but displacing, I mean, when I talk about an institution, I include exhibitions and fairs, the mechanisms that we avail ourselves to work for our communication. These places that are displaced now, that guaranteed the other, the audience. A while ago, I was thinking in terms of projects for places, institutions that had an audience. This drives me back into the origins of our practice, where you had an agenda of friends you would invite to your exhibition. To the extent that you became professional, you no longer had to invite your next of kin, you would just take it for granted. So in a way, this becomes quite strongful, it is quite forceful in our inside. It gets us much more involved with the other. And I agree on that one. The biennial is an example of experiences that had left me before with more questions in connection to that. With a biennial outside of my country, I could look for something, looking for other publics from the production of the piece, as the ones we did with the School of Ceramics in Buenos Aires. I believe that this type of things could help us all artists, rethink about other places from where to establish these new relations with the audience. I believe it makes you more responsible. In a way, it breaks down with this atomization, so to speak, of practices or functions, and it makes you take responsibility for the total whole. Then each and everyone has their own role, but at least so it's a matter of taking it into consideration. It's rather than looking for the big figure, there is an image that I was having after listening to Maria and Manolo. I liked the image of finding a new space. We are looking for a new space. Sometimes in the materiality of things, those mental spaces show up. And I liked those images, as Manolo was saying, how to resignify a balcony, how you move into it being so forceful, because the balcony is half your house, half outdoors, the more external part of your inner circle. And it's some sort of border where you don't really know where you are, whether you are inside or outside. And a while ago, I was seeing how movies were featured on cars. I mean, the auto cinema is going back to its zenith. I think it was in Australia. We had to pay attention to the spontaneous movement we start having a key there. We are quite many and we are acting by instinct, and we have to take a while and observe those things that are happening, those places we choose, how we are positioned in the middle of the storm. It talks a lot about us, and it can give us a lot of clues. There is something that comes about as a result of all these voices that we have brought together here, plus the ones that we have been reading with one another in front of reactions, the more fascistoid reactions, so to speak, with which the ones we are left with, are the ones that will encourage flexibility, that will encourage coexistence, the living together of what something that we wouldn't have admitted before, we wouldn't have imagined could ever exist. Auto cinema, it makes us almost laugh. It's humoristic, but it's a good piece of data of the daily affairs going into the reservoir of, the trunk of memories, and you can rescue a number of things and rethink about new terms, going back to revisiting why is it that we chose being in the place where we are. This is not a minor detail, and I don't say so from reivindicating our individual nature, but rather saying all of those here have chosen to work with others. How are we positioned? We are positioned in a way where we are deeply involved with community and with the social mesh. We didn't choose to be in art because of the side we are not that interested in, the one we have just got devoid of, as Eduardo was saying. I'm not that sure, but I'd like to imagine that this is the case. And in turn, we keep receiving questions. At this point, I feel I'm a TV host in a place that I never imagined myself I could be. Well, you hadn't chosen it, you didn't know, but it's yours for the taking. We have lots of questions, and at least so, I'll mention them as a situation so that you are all invited to a final reflection. It won't be the closure, it's just because we have to wrap up the meeting. There are people who think that, well, moving on to the virtual modality, if the previous version had quite a lot of elite and was undemocratical because of a number of issues of access to places and because of the imaginary frontiers, well, whether the situation of virtuality won't even generate more distances, because we depart on the assumption that everyone has access to connectivity, and that is actually not the case. This is one of the lines of thoughts that are shared with us, and others that pop up and start discussing about the issue, supporting the idea of generating a file of the present moment, all these records, but they even ask to rethink memes and not understanding all of them as a unity, because there are very many artists who truly are working with very valid strategies and building a community based on this. So these are two of the number of issues that we are getting as comments. And I'd also like to thank that we are very thankful to all those people that are on the other side of this, showing questions and comments, and a very high number of them thanking for being here. But I won't be the one closing. I would just like you to choose a few lines to comment or to claim whatever you want to claim. I wanted to say something in connection to elitism, to elites, or the difference that exists between different audiences and different cultures. Of course, there's lots of sectors that have no access to internet. These are the same sectors that have no access to museums, that have no access to biennials, who have no access to the market of art, etc. I mean, there is a social structure that is very unfair and inequitable, and of course this keeps up. It is even far more resented or affected by this situation. What we have is what we have handy right now, and what we are using out of a desperate need. We are in a situation where if we are looking for a number of solutions quite spontaneously, so this gives us a possibility for many possibilities to come out as a solution to serve the collective group. So nothing of what will happen right now will find a solution to the back problem, to the problem back down. And of course, that's evident. This virus won't create a revolution, or I don't know whether anyone will come along and bring about a revolution, but probably not the virus. When I talked about memes and I was critical of it, I criticized the implementation of it in mercantile terms and the society of shows, the show business, so to speak, when combining the art with that. But I fully agree that there is a lot of ingenuity in artists that work with lots of gifts and a variety of devices that are available, with a lot of creativity and with the sense of humor and with a lot of ingenuity, because in the end the limits, the boundaries of creativeness and aesthetics is healthily quite blurred, and there are a number of ways to resort to the creativity and to ingenuity that have to do with a number of elements that might not be considered as forms of big art, but whatever happens in the boundaries of big art is quite interesting in its own right. I didn't mean that as banality, because that is not it is not a banality at all. I just wanted to clarify because I'm quite critical of it. Well, I wanted to go back to the question, democratization. I mean, in our understanding of what Ticio was saying, I mean, democratization was also relative in connection to the spaces of contemporary exhibition and the phenomenon of contemporary art as well. But without a doubt, maybe so, it has to do with my recent experience. The public space of art, the crisis of the experience of art right now, is the crisis of the public and political space. In Chile, we have just lived through it, and we went over it in quite a radical manner. We were having this collective expression, the political, public expression, and all of a sudden, overnight, we had to stay at home. So having lost our public space, we wonder whether it didn't at the same time meant a lost opportunity of political and democratic struggle, just as you could wonder on democratization of the virtual experience of art. And maybe the most interesting thing to think when it comes to that as a question is precisely so the body as the more political space of all of us, and to the extent that this is not there or that this is in another different way, many of the ethical notions are redefined, the ones we can think about art and about this which is being called democratization. I don't believe that there is such thing as an answer for that, at least so. And this is how I think about it. We can, in the best of cases, ask questions based on this experience. For instance, just to draw a parallelism in the political dispute, given the loss of the urban space, we literally lost the urban space, we lose urban space. So my question is, do we lose the political struggle? Initially so, it seemed as if it happened, and we are kind of mourning on this. We lost the physical space in town, the body in town, and therefore our political struggle ability has been lost. But this became a question, and probably over time we'll be able to go over it collectively, never in an individual personal way, but we will be considering ways of political struggle and of political, democratic, artistic and aesthetic meeting that are under construction. Because maybe so, what's interesting in our experience is that this has happened all of a sudden. One thing is that you should lose your urban space because of law enforcement repression when there is a struggle or a clash. And another different thing is that this is something you cannot have access to because you can get contagion, because you can get a disease. It's self-care and solidarity with others. So this implies a very radical change in the way of thinking about politics, ethics, and cosmetics or aesthetic. And there is no answer for that for the time being. I don't think that the answer will be that museums will have lots of virtual programs and that all of the pieces of art will get dematerialized. I don't think that this is the answer. These are the processes we are living through, and we already are having an experience of how things get re-elaborated, the human relations, all of them based on this situation. And these are the interesting questions that we have to think about. Manolo, I would go back on to saying that we live in a system that is unfair. Some have a lot or almost everything, and the majority have almost nothing, not even access. And even if the world has come down to a standstill, continues to be the same. And the world has stopped a little, because when it comes, economy has stopped, or a few things have stopped. But the teleconnected society, as a matter of fact, we are somehow repeating or broadcasting or repeating behaviors, authoritarian behaviors. Let's not forget that the digital domain, as I said before, is Silicon Valley, is Facebook. It is a way that controls us extremely, and there are cracks. Additionally to whatever has been stated, I'd like to add two things. One, we have to learn that pandemics is a disease with different symptoms, and I believe it is necessary to learn that symptoms in Chile, or how we can keep a revolution in Chile, is different from how we can take action in Italy. And the way to learn, the time to learn has come right now. And in learning, it is necessary to think about languages, terms, vocabulary, new common terms. We should have some sort of glossary, a shared glossary. There are lots of terms that don't exist in Spanish and in other languages. We should get familiar with a term that being in the other, cabwa in Tagalog, doesn't exist in other languages. In the Maya language, there's lots of terms that indicate art, but not one as our term. And sharing is also important, not just terms, but also formats that will talk about cracks, Twitter, and the anachronistic format. As I always remember, an author from Spain who is not very well known outside from Spain, Rafael Sánchez Ferloso, on the journals, they started asking those who wrote papers to write papers with short phrases and with texts with 800 or 600 terms. He would write those texts 1, 2, 3, 4, and he would repeat them over the days with these subruptive phrases. A paragraph was a phrase that couldn't be transformed in any logo or motto. Those anachronistic forms, such as the ones that are enabled by technology, this new vocabulary, this new glossary, or this shared glossary, is a relevant element right now. Well, in closing, I would like to talk about the writer Dati Roy, whether this will be a portal or not. It's nice to understand this as an option of radical change. Nonetheless, if tomorrow the vaccine came out, what would happen? I hope that this would drive us into thinking, reflecting upon it more deeply. We have to redefine communication means. You were saying we pick where we want to be at. I don't know whether I picked internet. Internet picked us, all of us, and we are kind of subjected to this hyperconnectivity, which is wonderful for many things, but in other things we need to stop for a while. I mean, in the month and a half having to stay home, I feel vertigo of the excessive need of a number of issues and of daily life, looking for solutions in a rapid manner. So sometimes I think that we have to try and regulate, we have to try and create new coexistence manuals, not just in artistic terms, but in social terms, how to work in this hyperconnectivity and evaluating past possibilities. The auto cinema is wonderful, or as is happening in Colombia, it used to be very successful in the past. Radio education in rural areas. And for artists, well, taking a look at the communication, communicating with another, this is wonderful. And Voluspa, you were talking about this, how to reach the other, how to communicate with one another. There are a number of things in this digital hyperconnectivity or in more subtle actual kind of things. The radio on the farms were the ways that many young people got educated back in the old days, going back to analog methods or letters. I'm thinking a lot about that. I'd like to close on this and thanking you for this very valuable virtual space. So 2 more voices and then Annibal will close. Betsabe, I'd like to thank you for this invitation. It's been my honor to having spent time with all of you, and it's been very enriching experiencing with these new channels, these new territories. Not only do we have to look for in the past, and maybe very close from us in our own cultures, we will find paths that hadn't been that exploited by contemporary art to communicate with one another. It's not just to find, we have to earn it with practices that will be worth alternative and resistant to what will come next. We are countries, especially Latin America, who had a lot of crises, economic crises, earthquakes and whatnot. We do have the strength to find these new spaces, and I hope we can do it together. Good luck and take a lot of care. Resilience. Eduardo. In connection to what Voluspa was saying, Sebastián Piñeiras is one of the most thankful persons to COVID, I guess, for now, for the time being. Because he was at a verge of revolution, and it was remarkable. And when it comes to that, when it comes to big transformations, the body is unreplaceable, cannot be substituted. That's very difficult. to do it somehow differently. And when it comes to that, we are quite young in our experience in a pandemic, and to the extent that this will last, we will dress up in suits to go down on the streets. It won't stop. I mean, the body is everything, is presence, life, and it has more to do with life, with transformation of structures. Structures get transformed with bodies. So the image is very good, and I believe that you all read it. The novel of the Eternaut, where even with deadly snowfall, they try to come with ways to get organized down the streets and get organized. Well, you have the difficult task, Hannibal, to close. I'd like to keep going because there's lots of questions that have kept going. I try to summarize in some the trends, the main trends. I'd like to thank you very much to you all, and I must admit that some of the perspectives were deeply moving for me. And I leave now the floor to Hannibal. Thank you, Diana. I'd like to thank you all for having accepted this invitation and for having turned this meeting into something as rich as it has been. I'd like to thank Señas en Acción Institution and sign language interpreters. It's moving to think that there is out there a community we hadn't had access to, and beginning on this point now on, we'll keep having them. To thank those that have been online, several hundreds of them, and this also is a proof of the fact that we had the right idea. Again, I'd like to thank all participants, and if you allow me, I'd like to make a final reflection. When we talked and wrote, and I repeated this from the very beginning, on a different relation between center and periphery, I always feel kind of too utopic or somehow naive, because the relation between center and periphery has to do with economic and political issues which none of us, not all of us together even, can ever change. We cannot change it unless we embark on a long trail ahead of us. But based on what happened and on Voluspa, ways to consider the new ways of democracy and what other participants said, maybe we can think that it might as well be possible, at least so in the world of art, to have a relation, to establish a different relation between center and periphery. Now, in the division of center and periphery, except for Manolo, we are all periphery, but as there are more people in the center who think about Manolo, it will be important for us to rethink things. Thank you for joining us, and in 2 weeks' time, on the 23rd, we will try and have another meeting like this one. Surely tomorrow, the latest, the day after, we'll be able to announce the list of members. To those that had been online, please take it into consideration so you can stay online at the same time in 2 weeks' time. And if Diana felt she was the host, well, I also feel myself as a host who is willing to have an audience. So thank you all, and a big hug, a very true, heartfelt hug to all of you. Thank you. Bye.